Good morning, everyone. Very excited to be with you here today for this Introduction to Process Prototyping webinar. I'm Brian Reel. I am the Chief Process Geek here at ProcessMaker. I'm really excited to be doing this webinar with my colleague Giovanni Lopez, who's our training manager. So I don't do these very often nowadays. So again, it's really fun to be here. I kind of barged in on this one, and Giovanni said he'd let me do it. So I'm excited. We'll see how it goes. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about process prototyping. It's kind of a new topic for us, so excited everybody is joining for this webinar. So first, I'm going to quickly give a little introduction. What is ProcessMaker? What type of problems we want to use ProcessMaker for, whether that's for prototyping or for actual design and automation. It's going to be basically the same. Then we're going to go into the who, what, and why of prototyping. I'll talk about some of the alternatives that are out there, other tools you could use. And then I'm going to hand it over to Giovanni, and we're going to get hands-on and actually do some prototyping. So I'll probably take about 10, 15 minutes here to kind of lay out the problem for you. So first off, who's ProcessMaker? So ProcessMaker is an award-winning low-code IBPMS, business process management platform and workflow automation platform. I'm really excited to report, for those of you who didn't know it, we won the 2020 Best Digital Process Automation Solution, DPA solution from Cody. It's probably the most coveted of all software awards this year. It was kind of fun because in the very finals, we're located, our headquarters here in Raleigh, Durham, and the other finalist was a small little company about 15 miles away called Red Hat, now called IBM, and we beat them out. So just really happy about that, get to drive by that most days. So very, very excited about that. So what is the problem that we tend to try and solve with ProcessMaker? So generally, ProcessMaker is used, first and foremost, you should have some sort of issue around what we call siloed data. So lots of different systems, data trapped in those systems, probably older enterprise clunky systems, mainframes maybe even, banking cores for our financial clients, ERPs that are just notoriously clunky and expensive to make modifications to. And so you get these siloed data issues. Data is in these systems, you want to get them out. Then maybe you're able to solve that problem, getting data to and from a couple systems, but then you end up with this kind of concept of a siloed processes. So now you've got some things connecting, but the processes themselves are now siloed. And that becomes a problem for your customers, partners, stakeholders. This is the old term service-oriented architecture. Your stakeholder only cares about what they're trying to do, apply for a loan, file a purchase request. They don't care that this has to traverse multiple systems. And so it's going to traverse multiple systems and usually involves humans, hence the checks, the validation there that you see in red and in green. That's when you know you need a solution like ProcessMaker. So let's go on to kind of prototyping. So we know we have a problem, we want to prototype a solution. So here we're going to kind of present a bit of an alternative vision to what you would normally think of with business process management or workflow automation. So who should be prototyping? So if you're on this webinar, I'm hoping you are either a line of business manager, so LOB manager, and you know the business problem you want to solve. You've got some clunky spreadsheets with a lot of data. You're getting that from a system. You're being asked to do something else. And now you've got some stakeholders involved and you have an actual business problem. Business analyst, you might call yourself a business analyst or a subject matter expert. For many of us, those are going to be kind of indistinguishable, so an SME. Now, if you're a technological person, if you are a technical person on this webinar, then you're here because you want to be able to do things fast and you don't want to waste your expensive technology resources. So if you're an IT director or a systems director or even a CIO, you are actually building solutions for the business and you want to do this without technical resources. So the idea really here is 1, 2, and 3. We're not going to use technical skills to build prototypes. That's the point. That's where we get the acceleration. So who are the players? As I mentioned, subject matter expert, analyst, and developers when we're developing actual solutions, when we're actually building automatable business processes. But for the purpose of the prototype, we want to get rid of the role of the developer, or at least not use those skills so that we can do this quickly and provide and prove out business value. So why prototype? Why would we want to do this? Well, as I mentioned, you want to demonstrate to the business quickly. That's a key word there, quickly, and using few resources what success looks like. So for those of you who have been in entrepreneurial settings before, you'll be familiar with the minimum viable product idea. So that's what it is. A prototype is an MVP. We want to get to an MVP very quickly and fail quickly. That's the whole point. Get something in front of business stakeholders and have them say, this sucks. I would never use this. Or say, hey, this is great. Wow, this is going to provide massive value to us. And then you go and you get the approval to use resources to actually build this out, fine tune it, harden it, and put it into production, right? So MVP is a really cool, really key term here. So you want to do that to get stakeholder buy-in. So again, you should not use any expensive IT or technology resources creating an MVP, creating a prototype. That is key. The whole point, as I mentioned, is we want to solve business problems because that is where there is value. We want to figure out how we're going to deliver exceptional customer experiences and innovate, because if we're not innovating, we're probably not being very competitive. We're probably losing in that competition. So again, we want to enable the subject matter expert and analyst because they're closest to the business problem. They know what they want to solve. They know what value looks like and how much it's worth paying for, in fact. So what to use for prototyping? We think you should be using a no-code solution, right? Again, non-technical resources, no code. We're in the revolution of no-code, low-code. This is a wonderful time to be a subject matter expert or business analyst. You can actually develop your own solutions. You're going to need to develop, if it's a stakeholder, a customer, you want to be able to actually create a customer portal, see what that looks like, see what it feels like. Because customer experience, because user experience is so important today, you can't just kind of skip that step. Again, we want to experience it. And you should emulate, not build, connectivity to those core solutions. That is where everybody's eyebrows raise when you say, oh, I need to get SAP data. Oh, I need to get data from my banking core. Because everybody knows that's a laborious process. And everybody knows those vendors tend to be very unfriendly to other systems. Let's put it that way. So the result should be incredibly functional and incredibly realistic, right? We don't want anything that does not look like the final solution, because what matters to us is the actual user experience. So you got to pay attention to the details even in the prototype from the experience side. So we're going to actually have the process map. We're going to actually develop dashboards when you do this for real, and real customer-facing forms. And so the end result, again, it should be a fully functioning model, built and able to demonstrate, and you should be able to do that in less than a week, in many cases less than a day. It should look not just good, it should look spectacular. Don't let stakeholders' enthusiasm dampen because you didn't actually create an awesome user experience. Nobody's going to accept something less than an awesome user experience. And you're building this for non-technical users. Non-technical users, imagination is generally not the strength. We're used to looking at an app and thinking it's done when it's done, when it's shown to us. And so if it doesn't look great, that's it. You probably got one first impression you can make. It should be real. And here's where ProcessMaker shines above some other options we're going to talk about. It should be real. We actually want to show the data flow because we are focused on actual data. Like, I need to get that invoice number out of SAP. I need to get that customer account balance out of the banking core. And I want to feel what that's going to be like. And I will eventually have to connect to those systems. So again, real experiences. I'm going to be uploading data. What is that data? Is it a driver's license? Am I eventually going to do OCR on that driver's license to pull out key data and do a KYC check for a banking solution? Am I going to be able to discuss it via a chat interface? What is that all going to, am I going to be able to approve or reject via an email, via some sort of voting button in an email? I want to actually experience that. Again, forms, what is the customer going to experience? Those forms, those front-facing forms, exactly what are those going to look like? There's no reason to skip that step. You should be able to do that with no code and make it look awesome. So many of you, probably, hopefully all of you are familiar with the term wireframing. So there's a subtle difference here I want to make between wireframing and prototyping. So maybe you've used Balsamiq. We use it all the time. Great tool and really great for lots of things related to wireframing. So there's a subtle difference here between a wireframe and a prototype. So, okay, occasionally you're going to use those terms interchangeably. We use Balsamiq for a lot of things, but when we're talking, so wireframing, it's going to be great for design and aesthetics, so part of what we're talking about, great for user experience, not great for business process prototyping, really good for mobile apps. If you're prototyping a business process, again, it's a credit application process, and you actually want to show what that is going to be like to use it, then I think you can do a better job with something like ProcessMaker for that type of prototype, because you're going to really show the business process and the user interactions. ProcessMaker, you're not going to want to use that to design just a regular data mobile app or just a straight up DB kind of application, but again, great for process apps. So hopefully that kind of gives you some idea there. The output, a full business process diagram that you can discuss with the business, a full business process documentation, because you're going to need that anyway, and a functioning model. And the model you'll continue to build out once you get stakeholder approval, once you get budgetary approval to actually move forward. So again, do it quickly, fail fast if you're going to fail, as they say in kind of MVP building, or go forward. So the business process model is going to look something like this. So if you already have something like in Visio, then you're looking at the right kind of problem to solve with a ProcessMaker prototype, where we can actually model out the flow, tasks, their rules, gateways, sub-processes, and elements and connectors to other systems. You can see I've got the ability over here on the left to drag over Salesforce connectors onto this process map if I want to. So that's the process map. From ProcessMaker, I can then actually generate the documentation. So if I fill out what each of these tasks or gateways is supposed to do, then I will actually now be able to generate a PDF and share that as process documentation. And what about those connections, right? We know that that ERP is important. It's housing really important data. How can you actually do this without the connection? So here's the real trick that we're gonna deploy for building a prototype. So ProcessMaker has a bunch of connectors, right? We have actually scripts to all these systems that you see up here today. But the key here is don't use these. You're going to mock these connections. You're going to basically fake it. But you want to have that in mind, because you're going to have to replace it with a real connector. And why do I say that? Is because that's where people get hung up. That's where it starts taking too long. And that's where you need to have some concept of the API on the other end. So if you are technical and you want to go a little bit of the extra step, or you have kind of technical inclinations, and you really want to build something cool, then you can actually officially mock it. There are actually systems out there like Mockaroo, right? Name says it all, where it will mock the data that's coming back or being served by that external system. So you want to send a request to SAP, get back the amount and the invoice number, or again, do it to your banking core or to whatever other system you have. You can actually mock that and actually see a JSON object coming back, which is what ProcessMaker would consume. So that would be kind of a fun side project. You could otherwise just have a script that echoes the data back so that it actually feels like it's filling in, or you can create a table in ProcessMaker. Not sure what Giovanni's going to do today, where you've already got the data and we already generate an API for all of our tables. So now you could just imagine it's in another system. But here's some systems I would, if you're really doing a real prototype, I would kind of look into some of these as well. So that's it. Hopefully you're excited, and hopefully you kind of understand the difference between prototyping, wireframing, and just kind of building a demo for that matter. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Giovanni, and let's get prototyping. Thanks, everyone.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Brian, for that amazing introduction. Let me quickly share my screen, and we can start prototyping here. Let me see. Okay, cool. Let me know when you can see my screen, okay? You should be seeing the ProcessMaker process builder. Perfect. Okay, so before we start working on this process model, something really common that we see whenever someone's trying to start working on his project is that you have to have at least some base documentation that you're going to be using for your processes, right? So at least to have the list of tasks that you are considering to include in this process is going to be really useful for you. So in the quick process that we're going to be building here, what we're going to do is to create a basic version of a purchase order request. And what I'm going to show you today is that we're going to use it to put together a basic version of a purchase order request. Now, the best thing about this is that we're going to be able to see this process in action. I mean, we're going to be able to create a request related to this process. We're going to be generating a PDF document. This process is going to have actors. We're going to be including business rules here, functional prototype. Okay, we even are going to mock up a connection to a data source that we're going to be using for this process. So let me quickly start here, and this is what we're going to do. Basically, I'm just going to put together a process map here. Let me quickly start dragging and dropping some elements here. Here I'm going to have all of the required tasks and elements that I'm going to use for this purchase order request process. Okay, maybe we can consider that we're going to be working with 3 different actors for this lane that's going to contain all of the tasks that are going to be completed by the requester. Here we're going to have a space to assign some tasks to the manager, and finally we can have a director here. Okay, so in previous webinars I have shown you some basic information about how to use the different elements that we have in this process modeler and how easy it is to just start dragging and dropping different elements here in order to put together a process map that is going to be used to make graphic the idea that we have for this process. So the first task that we can consider for this process could be related to filling out the purchase order request. There we go. Then we can have a task that's going to be assigned to the manager. Maybe this is going to be related to selecting the vendor. There we go. We can also include a third task for the director who's going to be evaluating the purchase order. Okay, so as I was telling you, this is going to be a really basic version of a purchase order process, but what I want you to notice is how quickly I'm going to be able to put together a process map and add some configuration to it in order to have a fully functional process prototype. Okay, so here we're going to include a decision point. Here we're going to be validating if this request has been approved. There we go. So the text labels that we include in this kind of process maps are always really useful to make it more understandable, right? So if we're going to be sharing this process model with our managers, with our supervisor, they will need to quickly understand how this process is going to work. Okay, so we're going to have 2 options here. for this process to end, we could end up with a rejected request. That's going to happen for this end event. So if the director is not going to approve this request, maybe we can directly end this process. And if the director is going to approve this request, then we can generate, there we go, we can generate the purchase order document. That, as I was telling you, we're going to be actually generating a PDF document here. Okay, so let me see the map that we have here. You saw that it only took me like a couple of minutes to put together this basic map. We're gonna have a basic process where a requester is going to fill out a purchase order request. A manager is going to be selecting a vendor. A director is going to evaluate this request. And if this request is approved, then we're going to be generating the purchase order document, right? Now, something that I want to show you here is that we're also able to enable a public web form that we can use to allow external users to create a new request related to this process. Now you can see that I have different options here. I can either ask them to authenticate into ProcessMaker before they are able to create this request, or we can enable this public web form for everybody to be able to create a new request here. Maybe we want them to be authenticated, since this is going to also include information about the requester, but we're going to have both options here. Now, since we're going to have multiple start events here, we should include some text labels. Maybe we can have something like manual start and web entry request. Let me include some labels here as well. And that should be enough to have the very initial version of this process prototype. Request rejected and request approved. There we go. Let me save it. Okay, so as I was telling you, you can either create a new request using the ProcessMaker user interface, I mean, with this quick button right here, for example, or you can use the public web form that we're going to enable using this element right here. Now, this was just the first part of the prototype that we're gonna be building today. Now, the next thing that we need to do here is to start working on the screens or the forms that we're going to be using here. I need a form that for the requester to be able to include all of the information related to the purchase order. I need forms to allow the manager to select a vendor, to allow the director to evaluate this purchase order. So that's the next thing that we're going to do. Let me quickly go to the screen builder that we're going to be using here. Maybe you're already familiar with this screen builder that we have in ProcessMaker 4. Here, we're going to be working basically in the same way. We're just going to start dropping some elements from the toolbar that we have here to the empty canvas that we have here. So let's start doing that. Let me show you how this is going to be done here. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to include here, maybe it's going to be the logo that I have for my company. Of course, this is just a fake company. That's going to be called Giovanni Incorporated. Okay, so this is going to make this form look little more professional, as Brian was describing during the initial presentation, we need these forms to be spectacular, right? Not just fine, but really good looking forms. And you're gonna see how we just need to start including different elements here. And with some configuration, we're gonna get a fully functional form using the screen builder that we have here. Okay, so the first thing that we're gonna have here is maybe the requester name. There we go, and for the label, we can have something just like requester. We can also work with the email address that we're gonna have for the requester. Let me just quickly include a variable name and an email. Now, these variables that we're using here, we're gonna be able to use them whenever we need them. For example, if we need to get the requester's name or the order date to be included in an external document or to be included in a logic condition that we're gonna be using later, we're always gonna be using this kind of variables. Okay, and finally, we're gonna have the required date here. There we go. Now, this is going to get the current date, so the requester shouldn't be able to change this information. So you can see how quickly I can just configure this field as a read-only field. And maybe we can also include the item information related to the product that we're trying to purchase here. So let me quickly include a subtitle here. This is just going to read items. And you can see that I have a complete text editor to change the style that I'm going to have for this element. So maybe we can have something like this. There we go. Items. Let me include another table here. Here, I'm gonna need more columns. Let me just include 3 additional columns here. Now, what we're going to be doing here is to include the name of the item that we're gonna have. That's gonna be included here. We're gonna have the unit price for this item. We're gonna have the quantity. And finally, we should be able to calculate the total cost of this item. Okay, so let me start adding some variables here, and also I should edit the labels that I'm going to use. So here we were saying that we're going to be including the price. There we go. Here we're gonna have the quantity. So let me also change the variable name and the label that I'm gonna have for this specific field. And finally, we should be able to, as I was mentioning a moment ago, to calculate the total price based on the unit price and the quantity related to this item. So this is going to be automatically calculated. So let me also configure this as a read-only field. And that's it. Let me just include a submit button. And that should be enough for us to have a completely functional version of this initial form. Let me save this. There we go. And we can even get a preview of it. Let me go back to the screen I just created. I'm using a screen category called prototype. Okay, so let me quickly include these elements again. And what I wanted you to see is that from the information that we're going to get from these forms, what we're going to be doing later is to just create copies of this form. And those copies are going to allow us to create additional forms based on the fields that we already have here. Okay, so we already know that we need to define a variable name and a label for each of these fields. And this time we're gonna start saving the process that we have for this form as soon as we're done with this first section. Okay, so this was a read-only field. Let me save it. Okay, and we had the information related to the product that we're going to be purchasing here. Okay, you can see that whenever we start working with rich text, we're actually working with HTML code, right? So that's going to make really easy to change the style that we're gonna have for this kind of subtitles and whatever text you would like to include here. Okay, so again, let me include some columns here. And here, we're just going to include information about this product. Here, we're gonna have the item. We're gonna be working with the unit price. There we go. The item quantity. And finally, the item total price. Okay, something that we should always include in this kind of forms, the submit button. This button is going to allow you to save all of the information that you have entered here and to continue to the next step in the process. So let's take a look at the preview that we're gonna have for this form. You can see that we have the current date, and maybe the most important part is that we're gonna be able to calculate this total here. But for that, let me just change the type of data that we're gonna have here, since this should be a currency, and also this field should be a currency, right? So I just need to change that here. There we go, and this is going to be a read-only field. That should be enough for us to have the very initial version of the form that we're gonna be using here. Okay, so we're gonna be using this form in a moment, as I was telling you, and we're just going to be creating copies of this form in order to create the additional forms that we're going to be using for this process. So we already have the purchase order form. I can quickly create a copy of this. And we're going to be using the copy of this form in order to allow our manager to select the vendor. Okay, let me use the same name that I have for this form as the description. There we go. Okay, so you can see that we have now a complete copy of the form we just created. Since we don't want the manager to be able to modify any of this information, we can configure all of these fields as read-only fields, right? And we're gonna start adding new elements here. I can quickly create a copy of this subtitle. And here I'm going to have something like this, select vendor. Or maybe we can have something like vendor details. There we go. Okay, we have vendor details. And I would like you to pay special attention to what I'm going to do here. I'm going to mock a connection to an external data source. Okay, so we're going to be configuring a new select list here. And the information that I'm going to get from the vendors that I'm going to be listing here is going to be able to come from any external resource. Like, for example, we could have a connection to an external database. We could have a connection to, let me change this to selected vendor. Okay, so we can create a connection to an external database, to an external system. We could create an SAP connection, and a connection to Salesforce. Whenever you're storing all of the information from your vendors, you can mock up a connection using this kind of fields and the configuration that I'm going to be using here. And I'm actually going to be using a local resource. Okay, so you can see the different options that I have here. I can either manually list, I can request the data. This could be creating an external connection to an external server that's going to be providing us with this list of vendors, or I can use a data connector, and the example to be related to a data connector. Okay, so I just need to select the data source that I'm going to be using, and also the values and the contents that we're going to have for this list. So let me configure this. I'm going to be using the ID of these vendors for the value, and I'm going to be using the vendor name for the content. To my vendor database. And this is the endpoint that I'm going to be using. Okay, so let me save this. Perfect. Okay, and here we're going to get all of this information from this resource. Now, let me quickly go to the preview. And you can see how I'm listing different vendors here. But using the connection that I'm going to have, for example, if we select ProcessMaker, you can see how the system is getting the complete information that I'm going to have for this vendor. We're going to be able to get the contact. We're going to be able to know the products that this vendor offers. We're going to vendor. So we should be able to display all of that information here. Now, let me think of the kind of information that we would like to include here. Maybe we're going to need to display the contact person that we're going to have for this vendor. We can also be displaying the email address, this vendor city, and the rest of the information that we're going to have for this vendor. Okay, so for example, here, what I'm going to have is to the contact that I'm going to have for this vendor. You can see how I'm accessing the information that I have for this specific vendor, right? So let me apply the same configuration for each of these fields. I'm going to be working with the vendor email. There we go. Let me use email for the label that we're going to have here. Also for the city. And finally, we're going to be also obtaining this vendor's phone number. And maybe we can also display the kind of products or services that this vendor offers. Okay, now since this information is going to come from an external resource, we don't need this user to be able to modify any of this, right? Okay, so we can go to the preview and we can select any vendor here. For example, golden tomatoes here. And you can see how we are emulating the connection that we're going to have for this. We're obtaining the contact, the email address, the phone, the city, and also the products and services that this specific vendor offers. And that's going to happen every time we select a different vendor. Okay, so your managers are going to be actually be able to see how this information is going to be retrieved from an external resource. Okay, and finally, let me just create a final form that's going to allow our managers to approve or reject this request. Okay, so for that, I'm going to create a final copy of this. And this is just going to be used for the manager approval, okay? So let me change the name that I'm going to be using here. There we go. Okay, so what are the changes that we need to do here? Since the vendor has been already selected, we can get rid of this field. And I'm just going to include a final section for the manager to be able to evaluate this request. There we go, manager approval. And for that, we can have like a checkbox. And this is going to allow us to verify if the manager approved this request. So we can have something like this: manager approved. And for the label, we can have something like signed and approved. Okay. We can have something like that. And finally, a signature. Manager signature. That's going to be required. Okay, so if we go to the preview, you can see how quickly we generated a third form for this form. So we just need to sign and approve, and the manager is going to be able to include his signature here. Okay, so let me just make sure that this is saved. The last thing that we need to do here, you saw how quickly we created this process map. Forms took us a little extra time, but we have everything we need for this process to be fully functional. We just need to start configuring things here. So the things that we need to do here is to start selecting the different forms that we're going to be using here. So let me look for the purchase order form that I have for the first task. And we created a purchase order select vendor for the second task. And finally, we have a manager approval form, right? Okay, let me save this. At this point, we're going to be using a display screen in order to generate this PDF document. Hopefully, we're going to be able to see this document. And let me just configure the web entry that we're going to have here. This is going to ask users to authenticate before they create a new request. We can assign this to all of our employees, so anybody will be able to create a new purchase order request. There we go, employees, the screen that we're going to be using here. Let me look for the purchase order form that we're going to have. And that should be enough for the configuration that we're going to have for this web entry. Okay, I have a web entry generic thank you. This is already available here in ProcessMaker for me to use it, but we could, of course, design our own screen here. But let's use this generic one. The last thing that we need to configure here is related to the user assignment rules that we're going to have here. This is going to be assigned to the requester. For the next task, maybe we can assign this to the current user that I'm using, Giovanni Lopez here. So we're going to be able to go through the complete process. There we go. Let me save this. This is also going to be assigned to the employees group. And you can see how we're also going to be including some business rules here. So the expression that I'm going to be using here is related to the latest fields we added to our forms. If you remember, we have a checkbox called Manager Approved. That's going to be used in order to verify that this request was approved. Manager approved needs to be equal to true, right? And I'm going to have something really similar for this path. This is going to be different from true. Okay, and that's it. That's all the configuration that we need for this process. We have all of the user assignment rules. We have the business rules here. We have the screens that we're gonna be using. So let's start working with this. For this, I'm going to be using an incognito window because I'm gonna be logging in as a different user. Let me just get the URL that I'm going to use for this public web form. You can see it right here. That's the URL that I'm going to be copying and pasting here. And you can share this URL to all of your employees, maybe via email or on a web form, or you can even embed this form in one of your websites. So you can use it anywhere. Okay, you can see that I'm logging in as a different user, in this case, Jacob. And we're gonna start working with this purchase order. Okay, so as Brian was explaining during the beginning of this presentation, you saw that it took us like half an hour to build a complete process prototype here. You can already share this URL with your supervisors, with your managers, and they're gonna be able to actually create a new purchase order request. So for example, if we create one here for Jacob Rusak, we can have something like this, Jacob at giovanniinc.com. This is the current date. You can see it right here. For the required date, of course, we can. Okay, here, for example, we're starting to notice some changes that we need to do in this prototype, right? For example, we should be able to use a calendar field here in order to allow our users to select the dates. But those are the kind of changes that you notice as soon as you start creating your requests here. So really fast, we're already noticing how we can improve. Okay, so we're gonna be trying to purchase 2 computers at a price of 400 each. You can see the total price, and we're gonna be able to submit this request. Thank you for completing this request. If we get back to ProcessMaker task list, we're going to receive all of the information we just sent using the web form. And we're gonna be able to process that data and continue with the process map we built at the beginning of this demo. Right, okay, so the next task is related to selecting the vendor. Let me click here. And you can see that I'm using the form that we just designed, right? This is coming from Jacob Rusak. You can see the request date, the required date, the email that we have for this user. He's trying to purchase a computer at this price, so we just need to select a vendor. I can select any of these, maybe the information related to ProcessMaker. This is something we have already seen, how we get the complete information related to this vendor. As soon as we have selected a vendor, we can submit this request. And the final task is related to evaluating this purchase order, right? So we just need to review the information that we have here. We're going to sign and approve. I can just include a signature there. We're going to save that signature, submit, and that's it. Okay, but that shouldn't be everything that we're able to see related to that request, right? So if we can see the tasks that we have already completed, you can see the complete historical log related to this request. And something that we are trying to see here is the purchase order configuration. You can see how this PDF document has been generated. And it includes complete information about the purchase order. Okay, so we are almost done with this prototype. You saw how easy it was to put together this process prototype. I made it in almost half an hour here. We just had to put together the process model that we have for it. We built a couple of forms for it. We just had to configure the forms that we're going to be using for these different tasks. So that's how easy it is to create one of these process prototypes. Okay, so that's it for the live demo that we have for today. If you have any questions, you can always use the Q&A section of Zoom, or you can use the chat interface. Okay, we don't have any questions. We have a comment from Pat, who's mentioning something about the audio. Okay, anyway, we're gonna be sharing the recorded version of this webinar with you all as soon as we're done with this presentation, okay? One question from Valerie, who's asking what version are you using in this demo? We're using ProcessMaker 4.08, if I'm not mistaken. Let me show you the version that I'm using here. There you go, this is the version, ProcessMaker 4, version 4.08. Some other comments, very good presentation. Thank you both very much. Thank you very much. How to publish in my web page. Okay, if you're talking about the web entry that we used in order to create a new request here, you can use this URL in order to embed this form using an iframe on an external website, or you can just share this URL with any of your colleagues, and they're going to be able to access this web form. The case history that we see in 3.4 versus 4, it is different. Yeah, this is totally different. The information that you can get about your requests on ProcessMaker 4 is more complete. You're going to be able to see a summary here, all of the data that was interchanged between the different actors. Of course, this is you can configure all of this, all of the list of the tasks that were completed. You're going to be able to access to the complete list of files that you're going to be displaying here, and also the forms. So you get so much more information here. Okay, so will that generate a separate audit logs? Yes, you're going to have a different audit log for each of your requests. And in a different webinar, we're going to be able to see how we're going to be creating a complete report related to a complete process, okay? Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you very much for taking the time to attend this webinar. Hopefully, I'm going to be seeing you on a future event. Remember that you can always go to processmaker.com to see the upcoming events that we're going to have. You're also able to find the recorded versions from previous webinars there. So thank you very much and have a great day.